was that this is where a public investment would have the greatest visual landmark impact on traffic. Most of the traffic is coming down Wisconsin, actually, and of course there's some going north, a good deal going north-south on 27. So the idea was to create a very strong visual impact here to indicate that there were improvements and that this was a revitalized street, and that to sort of rebrand the street to some extent. And then people were curious about how this might actually be designed, and these are not, even though we do a lot of urban design work, these were just intended as very general illustrations of one way to interpret this concept. So this is Wisconsin over here. This is 27th Street. The traffic going north comes up, goes around these two islands. These islands facilitate pedestrian crossing. There are small public spaces on the corners. These are side drive lanes that also allow for parking. You pull in, they're one way, and you park, and then you leave. So that was one illustration of the concept. Somebody asked, well, what if we just do it on one side? So this was a slightly different illustration of how those side drive lanes might be configured to create some green space and activity on one side, and leave the west side, in this case, a typical sidewalk configuration. This was a more detailed traffic drawing of it, mostly to show that there was some ability to look at these and see how well they work. And then, of course, there was the tunnel option. Now, the tunnel option, because it's extremely difficult to estimate, because you don't know where the tunnel's going in and where it's coming out, investigating all the utilities that would need to be changed would take our whole budget. So instead, what our engineers did was essentially use comparables along with the city staff to figure out what these kinds of facilities cost on a linear foot basis, and it came out to around $50 million. And because that number was so dramatically different than the other numbers, we didn't investigate it any further. We're not saying it's not valid. We're just saying it's really a very different kind of alternative, and sort of really beyond the scope of what we were asked to do.
I think it needs to be said, though, that the tunnel concept was motivated by a desire to move the through traffic through the neighborhood on some means other than surface streets, which would allow the surface streets to be more neighborhood-oriented and thus avoid the need of acquiring right-of-way.
Right.
Correct?
Right.
Because this does have a dual function, this section of street. It both serves a neighborhood function, which is what the West Side Land Use Plan, in fact, contemplates, and it's the whole premise of the Sohi District Main Street program, is to promote local retail, restaurants, amenities, pedestrian activity, while at the same time handling a substantial through traffic of not only motor vehicles but heavy trucks to a certain degree, correct?
Yes.
So the tunnel idea was to siphon off the through traffic to get it out of the way without the need to acquire additional right-of-way to accommodate on the surface both neighborhood street and through street functions.
Correct. And also the tunnel option also put on the table an idea that led to this proposal.
Right.
And the tunnel option was also intended to show maybe something grand or monumental or very significant could be done that would really have a major impact on this neighborhood.
Right. The Grand Boulevard, the center lanes become the tunnel, in effect, on the surface, carrying the through traffic while the side lanes carry the local traffic.
So I'm not going to go through all the steps in the conversation, but essentially from the tunnel we finally wound up with this, which we think would have actually a much stronger visual impact, still come pretty close to doing what it needs to do in terms of the traffic, and also most likely would have a much lower cost.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, Alderman Wade.
can I ask a question? Because I'm looking at all of this, and one of the things that just keeps dancing in my head is how much property we would have to take and how much assessment we would lose with each plan. That's one of the things that seems to be important to me. So I don't know if you can incorporate those numbers into each one of the plan, or how you would do that, but that's an important item with me.
Yes, Alderman. For the median solution, either it's some combination of the east side or the west side of the street would have to be demolished. And those estimates for the east side were around, again, just broad ballpark.
These are annual numbers, correct?
This is the value, the cost of the acquisition. We didn't do the property tax calculation, but we will do that.
Okay.
And that will be in the final report. The other aspect of the final report is we're also supposed to propose what the value of what new development might be and how much that might bring in terms of tax base. And, of course, the difficulty with that is that the new development will have significant value at some point in time, but it's very difficult to figure out in terms of market conditions when that value would actually phase in. So we're going to provide those numbers, but then actually sort of saying, okay, here's the trade-off. That's a higher-level policy decision. We're simply trying to analyze and provide those sort of basic facts and quantities.
So, Alderman Wade, I mean, you make a great point.
I mean, I'm sure these questions came up during some of your meetings. I know, just knowing you the way that I do, Alderman Bauman, you had to consider that.
Right.
That
I mean,
fact.
you make an excellent point. I mean, we would not even, well, this analysis wouldn't go beyond this level if the only issue that arose was, well, we're going to lose X amount of tax base, period, and build a pretty street. The whole point was, how do we invigorate this entire corridor? How do we induce new development or redevelopment, more intense development versus what's there now? I mean, we're going to be, if we lose land uses, most aren't particularly desirable at this point. We're gas stations, corner stores, convenience stores, abandoned buildings, unused buildings, underused buildings, versus what potentially could replace them if this would have the catalytic effect that some think it might. But that analysis will take place down the road. But you're absolutely right. If it turns out that the net effect of this is losing $14 million worth of tax base with no new tax base replacing it, that's
and then the timing on that. I mean, of course, all of that stuff takes time, but how much time elapsed before we actually start seeing a return on that?
Very good question, and that'll require more analysis. Commissioner.
I'd like to piggyback on Alderman Chair Bauman's comments. This is a very significant intersection. If you look at what's been done in Alderman Donovan's district and the continued support by Layton Boulevard's West, the National Avenue, the Silver City district, that's a very significant area as a gateway into the south side. This is a very significant area, gateway into the north side, the whole Sohai district. If you look at our main street, the city's main street, I think it acknowledges West Wisconsin Avenue. And you look from the Calatrava on the far east, going into Story and then points west. The one area that really requires some significant reinvestment is an area that's really centered around this intersection of 27th and West Wisconsin Avenue. So I think Alderman Bauman's challenge to us was think big and think about how we could really catalyze this. And I share his enthusiasm for thinking big. We also have the reality of what you've put on the table, and certainly Alderman Bauman is very cognizant of that, and that's why I opened my remarks very cautiously saying that this is not a plan, this is not something that we're committing to, but it does give us the context and a lens to think of how we could best develop that property. And as you know, being a Rackham Commissioner, Redevelopment Authority has been struggling to try and get a catalytic development at the portion of 27th and West Wisconsin that the Redevelopment Authority owns on behalf of the city. The school board has had various plans for what it wants to do with that Wisconsin Avenue school. The county obviously has a large land holding very close to there. That, in effect, the fact that three major institutional owners, which are all governmental entities, actually have sizable holdings within the impacted area, may make it easier for us to actually assemble this. And so I think that what we would like to do is, once again, while your point is extremely well taken, we're going into a budget cycle, we're all very tuned in, as we always are, to property tax base. The question would be, would this, in its implementation, yield us more tax base than we have now? And I think that's an open question, and it's something that we're going to have to further explore. and the consultant will address it at least at its base amount in the report that will be provided to committee subsequent to today's presentation, at least in today's dollars, what that impact would be. I think what's going to be more difficult is to put a number on and to try and quantify what potential future development could be if this were in fact either wholly or partially engaged by the city.
Well, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Sure.
I mean, I think this is a great idea. I mean, I really do. I mean, not only the stuff that you just mentioned. I mean, Marquette is growing, and it's growing